You know, in the 10 essentials of Tai Chi, one of them states that upper and lower follow one another. And expansion of that thought is that your movement is rooted in your feet, stabilized through your legs, commanded by your waist, and expressed through your hands. You know, last week we talked about the Dantian being the center of our mass and the fact that we needed to have that over our base of support in order to be stable in our movement. And we talked about being rooted and grounded and how that helps us be more stable. The Dantian being that commander, that's your waist, that area there. That this essential, we talked about 3 of those things last week: rooted in the feet, stabilized through the legs, and commanded by the waist. We even did a form where we took our hands completely out of the equation and put them on the Dantian and did the entire form so that we could feel that commanding by the Dantian. But this week, we're going to put the hands back into the discussion because it completes that whole phrase. You're rooted in your feet, stabilized through the legs, commanded by the waist, and expressed through the hands. You have to think about what your hands are doing. You know, I don't often tell you to focus on your hands because I don't want you to do pushing chi like this, because that breaks the principles of your columns. It breaks the principles of being rooted and grounded. But today we're going to focus on the hands, but in the context of those other principles. So let's look at pushing chi. I'm going to turn this direction, bring your left foot forward, and just come into your pushing chi. And let's think about it in terms of, are you rooted through your feet? You know, you're not letting your back heel lift up. You're lowering that center of gravity. You're stable in your stance. You know, you're not in a narrow stance like this. So you're stabilized in that stance through the legs. You're moving from the Dantian. That's keeping those columns intact, helping you understand your substantial and insubstantial. But now let's think about all of that energy coming up through the feet, through the legs, through the transfer box of the Dantian. It's expressed out through your hands into your opponent. Take a nice deep breath in and then breathe out. And remember, what you're doing with your hands is you're pushing your energy, all of that energy, into your opponent, pushing them away from you. So your hands are actually very important vehicles of what's happening with the rest of your body. You know, your hands are they're connected to your arms. They're an extension of your arms. Your arms are actually an extension of your torso. If we start to think of it in that way, it's an integrated movement. So bring your right foot forward, do your pushing chi again, and see if you can integrate that feeling of the energy coming all the way up from the bottom through the Dantian and expressed out through the hands. Sometimes it helps to really utilize the breathing as well to get that feeling of expression through the hands. Breathing in. As you come back towards your body, you're gathering that energy, and then you're breathing out and pushing that energy into your opponent. Let's look at part the wild horse's mane. So bringing your weight over to the right, holding that ball to the right, stepping out, using your rotation to let your body just open up into your part the wild horse's mane. We're rotating on that central column. We're stable in our base. Taking a nice deep breath in, we step out, part the wild horse's mane. But what are our hands really doing here? It's a kind of energy that we use in Tai Chi where we're actually splitting, separating our opponent's energy so that their energy is going in two different directions, which makes them vulnerable, which is what you want. You want to have your opponent be vulnerable. You want to have the advantage. So you have to learn to split their energy. Sometimes with new people, as they're learning part the wild horse's mane, they'll step out first and get the first one. And then as they're thinking about gathering and they come across like this, that's not the correct energy with your hands. You're not splitting your opponent's energy. You're not separating their energy. Really, if you do this, you're really just holding the ball, holding the ball. That's not part the wild horse's mane. You have to think about splitting your opponent's energy, separating, then you gather that energy and look at your hands. They're important. This is the expression of the energy that you're trying to accomplish, and that's separating your opponent apart. You're not literally splitting them open. You're separating their energy so that they are vulnerable to a further attack from you. That's important. So when you practice your part the wild horse's mane, I do want you to obviously let the rotation relax your body. You're coming into this separating with that relaxed rotation, but make sure your hands are expressing that energy of splitting. Deflect, intercept, and punch. Remember, we always want, even when we have a fist, it's an open, loose fist. We're not clamping down because what does that do? That blocks the flow of the energy. So with deflect, intercept, and punch, you really have to focus on your hands to make sure they stay open and loose, even though it's a fist, and you're stepping out here, blocking. Then you're taking hold of your opponent and then using that energy to punch right into them. Again, rotation is very important in this. When you think about, I'm taking what's coming at me and pushing it away from my face, taking hold of them, and then using my rotation to put that punch, that energy right into them. You have to think about what am I doing with my hands? Deflect, intercept, and punch is a fun one because it's very hand oriented. Wave hands like clouds is wave hands like clouds. Thinking about what am I doing here? I'm pulling this energy across. And if I were to use this against an opponent, am I coordinating that energy up from the ground through the dantian, through this rotation? Of course, I would go faster if I were really fighting someone. But that doesn't mean that you can't focus on where is my energy? What am I doing? Can I feel, are my hands in a good position to actually accomplish what I'm trying to do with that movement? Let's take kick, smash, and box the ears, which, at first blush, you're like, well, that energy is coming out through the foot, which is true. The kick is, absolutely. Then as we smash, we land and box the ears, we're actually coordinating all of that energy and integrating it to come against our opponent. Think about what we talked about last week. In order to be stable in this one-legged stance, You have to have your dantian, your center of mass, over your base of support. This leg is now empty, but let's think about that energy coming up and being released. Look at the coordination of the foot and the hand. Smash and box the ears. Again, having that fist be open and loose. But that integration of your whole body into this movement actually calls back one of the external harmonies of the feet and the hands need to be coordinated. If your feet and your hands are coordinated, that rooted in the feet, that energy coming up from the ground, stabilized through the legs, commanded by the waist, and expressed by the hands, can happen with an integrated movement. Repulse the monkey. When we do repulse the monkey, let me step up closer to the mirror here because I'm going to move backwards. If we think about it, we're taking this big ball of energy here and we're compressing it down to where we can utilize that energy right at the point where we need to push our opponent away. Think about it here, stepping back. Remember, my dantian is the commander. I use my rotation, but I'm pushing my hand, utilizing, expressing that energy into my opponent. This is what happens sometimes, again, with new people learning repulse the monkey, because there's a lot going on with that, is they'll start to do this, bringing the back hand up, but then it just kind of comes into a weird kind of dance going back. And if you think about it, that's not a coordination, that's not an expression of the energy with the hands. If I just start to do repulse the monkey like this, and I'm not focusing on that ball of energy and pushing my opponent away, then I don't have I don't have a proper idea of what are my hands doing here. Bring your left foot forward, bring that left hand in front. Your weight comes to the right. Remember, we have to integrate all those columns, that substantial and insubstantial. Bringing this right hand up and over, here's your ball of energy. Think about it. Step back. This is where your hands coordinate with your feet because you need to be stable in order to turn and push. So your feet and your hands are coordinated in that repulse the monkey. Let's do that one more time. Left is forward, bringing that right hand up and over. Focus on your hands, pushing that energy into your opponent and getting away from your opponent. There's a move in the form that is we don't talk about a whole lot, high pat on horse, that's exactly like repulse the monkey. Only instead of getting away from your opponent, you're actually going into your opponent. And that's sometimes the better strategy. You know, if I am fighting a taller, bigger person, I don't want to be at the end range of their foot or their hands because that's where all the power is. That's what we're talking about here. If I can get inside of that, I'm in a better position. So high pat on horse, think about it. We have our weight on the right, we're stepping left, and we're doing that exact same thing with our hands, except now we're going into our opponent. We have to think about being rooted and grounded, letting that dantian be our commander, but then our hands have to express that energy. So high pat on horse is the exact same thing as repulse the monkey. You're just going into your opponent instead of away from your opponent. Let's look at one more movement which feels almost the most natural with this idea of our hands and what are we doing with the energy that we're producing. Are we just playing with it, or can we focus and really get a sense of an opponent? Holding that ball to the right. Remember, here's your ball. And when we first learn ward off, remember we talk about making that ball small by bringing that left hand up. So now that ball, you were here and now it's here, it's between your hands. You utilize that energy against your opponent as you ward off, as you bump. Then grasping the bird's tail. Notice that I'm still within my columns, but I have that ball of energy. And then I yield to my opponent as I roll back, but I still am concentrating on what am I doing with my energy. And then as I rotate and press, I'm pressing that energy into my opponent. And then here's our pushing chi, which we started with. No, I don't want you to constantly focus on your hands as you're doing your Tai Chi. But if we think about it, the hands are that final expression into our opponent. We need to know what they're doing so that they're not just flopping around. Holding that ball, think about energy, making that ball small, ward off, use that energy against your opponent. Grasp the bird's tail, roll back, rotate and press, pushing chi. Let's do it on the other side of the body, bringing your weight over to the right, back to the left. Think about what are your hands doing, ward off. They're utilizing that energy, grasp the bird's tail, roll back. You're yielding to your opponent. Rotate and press. Pushing chi. So just real briefly, let's come back to that pushing chi that we started with. Think about being rooted and grounded. Lower your center of gravity just a bit. Make sure your stance is stable, that it's wide enough, not too long, not too narrow, but it's a good stable stance. Now imagine energy that you can use as it comes up through the dantian and then out into your opponent. Taking a nice deep breath in, breathing out, breathing in, and breathing out. Bring your weight up onto that left, step forward with your right, and just push forward. Good. Even though we can focus on our hands, we're still moving from the dantian, keeping our columns intact, making sure we're rooted and grounded. We know where our weight is, and we can utilize our breath to help that movement through our body, that energy movement. One more. So the hands, even though we took them out of the equation last week, the hands are actually a very important piece of that overall sense of an opponent. What am I doing with my hands? They are an extension of my arms, which is an extension of my trunk. I am one integrated movement particle. I like to say I'm a one integrated weapon. And that's important because if I were separated, I'm not nearly as useful. But as an integrated unit, it comes together much more successfully against an opponent. So let's do our form now. And yes, I still want you to think about what are my hands doing? Can I feel that energy? Can I feel it as connected to the rest of my body? But don't forget being rooted and grounded, being understanding your substantial and insubstantial, keeping those columns intact. This is part of the beauty of Tai Chi, because you have to think about so many things that you're actually helping your brain as well. So